Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. I'm Heidi Shoop, President of the Council, and on behalf of the board and members, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to welcome our speakers. Mike Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and our moderator, Ginger Thompson of the New York Times. Tonight, we look toward Cuba and the discussion of a long-running U.S. policy of sanctions and ask, is it time for the United States to normalize relations and end the sanctions? The history of U.S.-Cuban relations is a long and sadly almost uniformly troubled one. Since the revolution in 1959 and the coming to power of Fidel Castro, U.S.-Cuban relations have been variations of bad or worse. An economic embargo and various degrees of other sanctions have been in place for decades. In recent years, with the aging of Fidel Castro and the change in U.S. administrations, the issue of normalization of relations is more and more a subject of discussion. Tonight, we have decided to host a discussion, a debate really, to flesh out this subject and to help us understand the various issues at play. Our moderator is Ginger Thompson, a Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Her work has focused heavily on Latin America. Most recently, she has written about the United States' expanding role in Mexico's drug war and the United States' policy with Cuba. She has served as the Times bureau chief in Mexico City, and she was part of a team of Times reporters who were awarded a Pulitzer Prize for their series, How Races Lived in America. Ms. Thompson will introduce our debaters, so please join me in welcoming Ginger Thompson and our distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank the World Affairs Council, first of all, for inviting me to moderate a debate on such an important topic and with two very distinguished speakers. We don't have a lot of time tonight, and I know that you all are as eager as I am to hear from the two gentlemen seated to either side of me. But before we begin the debate, I would like to take a few minutes to put this conversation in the context of the current state of play. If this were 1962 and I told you that it was more likely that the United States would elect a black man president than lift the embargo against Cuba, I bet you'd have called me crazy. But here we are. The world has changed. We have robust relations with communist governments in Vietnam and China. The Berlin Wall is down. The Soviet Union has disappeared. And still the centerpiece of Washington's policy toward Cuba, it's an economic embargo that prohibits travel to the island and trade, remains almost as solid today as it did when it was established to break Fidel Castro's undemocratic hold on power. 5 decades later, that goal remains unfulfilled. Raul Castro may have taken day-to-day control of the island, but many believe his older brother still controls or still wields real power in the country, and some even say veto power over policy, and particularly over policy that has to do with the United States. Meanwhile, the lives of average Cubans continue to be defined by shortages of food, opportunities, and freedom. But does that mean the embargo has failed? I'm not so sure. One could argue that the embargo has put the Castro brothers on the ropes, that economic pressures have forced them to open the island to more foreign investment and to more free enterprise than at any time since the Cuban Revolution. These are some of the arguments that are swirling through the Cuba policy debate. I suspect that tonight you'll learn that this is one of the most polarizing debates on Capitol Hill because it raises complicated political issues and ignites deep personal convictions. I also think you'll learn that recent shifts by the Obama administration have done little to please leaders on either side. We have two such leaders here with us tonight, and it is my honor to introduce them to you. First, to my right is Mike Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez is the current Vice President of Communications for the Heritage Foundation. He spent nearly 20 years as a journalist, including 15 years for the Wall Street Journal in Europe and Asia. He left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he helped explain fiscal and foreign policy to U.S. and overseas audiences. First, he was at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then at the State Department. Mr. Gonzalez was born in Cuba in 1960 and left at age 12. He also has lived in Belgium, France, Spain, Hong Kong, and South Korea, and he spent months living and reporting from Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, Panama, and Cyprus. To my left is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Colonel Wilkerson served 31 years in the Army before joining the State Department. His previous positions in government include serving as Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell and serving as Associate Director of the State Department's Policy and Planning Staff under the directorship of Ambassador Richard Haas. He has taught at both the U.S. Naval War College and at the George Washington University. And he has held positions of Director and Deputy Director of the U.S. Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia, He is currently a professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. So, there are no real rules to tonight's debate except the ones that I may make up along the way to keep us on schedule. You both have very strong feelings about this subject, and so I look forward to a lively conversation. And at some point, we will open the floor for questions from all of you. So, Mike, let's start with you. I read a lovely blog post that you wrote a little while back for Heritage that, among other things, described your memories of Cuba, specifically memories of how your grandmother stood up to communist authorities who tried to enlist you in youth clubs. It was a column that made clear to me that the campaign for democracy in Cuba is not just the stuff of State Department planners. It's an issue driven by stories of human drama. I'd love to hear your brief opening remarks, but I wonder if you might also share with us some of your memories as a way of opening a window onto the human dimension of this debate and of putting your positions in context.
I will do just that, Ginger, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you all of us for coming here for this discussion on Cuba. As Ginger said, I left Cuba at the age of 12. I was born into communism. I left after my father died. I was able to see in a very terrible way what it was like to live under that repressive regime. I was able to see as a school child how my teachers and principals bullied me. That's right, teachers and principals, to get me to denounce my family, my parents, my church, and tried to get me to join the Young Pioneers, which I didn't. I was able to see what it did to my parents, how they had to live under absurd economic rules that went from a first-rate economy to a barter economy, how my father had to trade whiskey and cigarettes for milk for me and my sister, a practice that was against the law. He could have gone to prison for that. I saw what it did to them, to be afraid of going to prison for expressing their thoughts. I made a career all over the world as a reporter and as an opinion writer to defend freedom for that reason. Let me tell you about the foreign dimensions of this. That's just a human event. That's just a human side of it. Now, Colonel Wilkerson was not the only foreigner in Cuba last week. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was there. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was in Cuba not to go to the beaches, not to forge corrupt joint ventures with generals who run the Cuban economy, not as many European middle-aged men do to seek sexual favors with young Cuban men and women. He was there because Mahmoud Ahmadinejad understood what many people who support normalizing relations with Cuba today perhaps forget, and that is that the Cuban regime will be a very eager and willing, and eager accomplice to any state, any nation, any group, any individual who mean to do us harm. And that is because the organizing thought, the organizing principle of the Cuban regime is anti-Americanism, is anti-democracy, and is the suppression of the same freedoms that Ahmadinejad suppresses in Tehran. Now, it's not just the fact that if we open to Cuba right now, we'd be opening it up to unprincipled businessmen and corporations who want to do business with the generals. And it's not just that Castro hates democracy. It's the human, what is happening right now. Because my story is not just something that ceased to happen 40 years ago. Let me tell, the dirty little secret about Raul Castro is that he has unleashed a wave of violence and brutalization over the last year, especially over the last 6 months. Let me tell you about the Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white. This is a group of defenseless women who try to march to church on Sundays. I say try to march because they're harassed, they're beaten, they're punched by government goons who's sent in, bussed in by the regime. How dare they? 2 months ago in Santiago de Cuba, outside Cuba's holiest shrine, this group of women were not content with punching them. The mob stripped them to their waist and dragged them through the street. And it's not just Las Damas de Blanco. 2 weeks ago, the Cuban Commission on Human Rights and National Reconciliation announced that a record 786 political arrests occurred in Cuba last month. Imagine that, 786 political arrests in just 1 month. I'll be done in 1 minute. I'll get my 5 minutes.
Okay.
That brought the number of arrests, short-term, some of them long-term, political arrests in 2011 to 4,123. Imagine that in a year that has 365 days. They took place for a reason, to intimidate and to promote fear. Now, I agree with Colonel Wilkerson and people who want to normalize relations with Cuba. I want to as well. After the Castro regime gives the Cuban people self-determination, the freedom that we all enjoy here, the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to vote. But I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it unilaterally. I wouldn't do it preemptively because that would legitimize the regime in place. It would give them what they seek, which is legitimization. The Cuban people are the ones we have to keep faith with here. Not the Cuban regime, it's the Cuban people. Don't forget that. Don't abandon them. Don't ignore them. This is the people we should be. What is happening on the island right now, not this arid debate here over normalization. These are the people I want you to keep in mind. Thank you.
All right. Colonel. Mortimer Zuckerman published a column recently in the New York Daily News. And he wrote that American policy toward Cuba has been held prisoner of the past. That with so much, or so many circumstances that animate our conversations and views are drawn from the days when the island was a menacing outpost of an aggressive Soviet Union. I know you were there recently and just got back. I'd love for you to, one, give us your opening remarks if you have any, but two, talk about how your recent experiences in Cuba have shaped your views about American policy there.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction, too. Let me just start off by saying that one of the problems we have, I think significant problems we have with this issue is that people don't care. And you can't blame them. I mean, after all, we've got Iran, we've got Iraq, we've got Afghanistan, we've got a financial situation in this country that I think is as profound as the Great Depression. Our leaders on both sides of the political aisle have been telling us fibs about this for so long. We've financialized this country. Today I listened to a documentary, watched a documentary about how Goldman Sachs is devastating the commodities markets. Not content with the banks, they're now devastating through speculation the commodities markets. So it's very difficult to get Americans' attentions about 11.5 million people 90 miles off the Strait of Florida, off the other side of the Florida Strait. Extremely difficult. Who cares? In my conversations with the head of the Cuban National Assembly last week, Ricardo Alarcon, we had this discussion. Who cares? Well, I care. And I know that Mike cares, and I know that there are a small group of people in this country, I hope you're included in them, who care also. I'm not for a rush to normalize relations. For one, I think it would damage Cuba. I'm not for going back to 1959, the first time I went to Cuba with my grandmother when I was 14 years old. My grandmother, 60 years teaching the first grade. My grandmother turned to me when we got off the boat and said, "Don't go to the whorehouses or the gambling dens." That's what Cuba was. We need to face the fact, I think, historically, and you can go back a lot further than this. You can go all the way back to the Spanish-American War, when essentially we interfered in Cuba's fight for independence and took over the island. It was almost as if, when the French were at Yorktown, the French said, "Okay, Washington, you can't come to the conference. Oh, by the way, we're going to New York and we're going to expropriate a whole lot of land. We're going to take over just about everything of value in your country. We were your ally, but watch what we do now. This isn't your country, it's our country." So we traded one dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who was a criminal, whom Myers Lansky and his casino owners took $1 million US to every month in hard cash in a bag, for another dictator who was a communist. So that history to me, though, is not, it's relevant to those of us who want to think about it. But what I'm talking about and what I want to talk about, what I want to focus on, is what's happening today. And what's happening today, whether it's a result of the embargo or not, is irrelevant to me. I personally don't think it is. I think the embargo post-Cold War, 1991, 1992, was farcical foreign policy, essentially because a small minority of Americans in this country had a grip on a policy that nobody else cared about. And congressmen, when they would talk to me, and senators, when they would talk to me, would admit that in private. One congressman even said to me when I was lobbying for the ag and travel bill, some relief on agriculture and travel, just a tiny little bit of relief, I'm with you. And I said, why was I so persuasive? And he said, "I lost my primary in my home state. I can vote my conscience now." So that's the real truth about it. What I'm looking at is the present, and the present is this, and that translates roughly into Cuba in a time of change. This book has an economist from Hamburg, an economist from Barcelona, an economist from Madrid, and 6 economists from Havana. And they're talking about what's happening in Cuba right now. And what's happening in Cuba right now is being aided and abetted by the Germans, the Canadians, the French, the Chinese, the Venezuelans, and a host of others, but it is not being aided and abetted. In fact, it's being essentially injured by the U.S. policy. And so my point is simply that we need to examine carefully how we change that policy gradually and slowly. I'm not racing to anything, so that we help the 11.5 million people on the island of Cuba who need help and are getting help from others, but not from us.
How would you answer, Mike, the charge by those who say, we've done this now for 50 years and the Castro government still stands? Shouldn't we try something else now?
Well, the only way we could force the Castro regime, the generals with the guns and the bullets and the sticks to release power would be to invade Cuba. And we're not about to do that, and you wouldn't want us to do that. An embargo doesn't work in that way unless you have the embargo like we had in South Africa, where you get the whole world to agree on this. Now imagine that. We got the whole world to get rid of apartheid because we had the whole world. The South African regime was not only allowing less than 20% of the population to vote. And we said, this shall not stand. And we got together on that. The Cuban regime for 60 years has not allowed anyone to vote. And I think that a statement, why don't we have a Cuban Nelson Mandela? We have one already, and Tunis. Why don't we support him? He doesn't want us to lift the embargo. He's there right now. He can't speak to you, but I can. I can speak to you for him.
But is this working?
Well, it is in the sense that we're on the side of history. The Cuban regime is a bunch of octogenarians. Fidel and his brother in their 80s, they're afraid. There's no youth. The next guy in charge, Machado Ventura, is what, 82? There's nobody. The clock is ticking on this one black man in the Council of State, in an increasingly black island. This is a very unrepresentative regime. We're on the side of history on this. I have the words of the Cuban dissidents who say, don't do this, don't give them the oxygen right now.
Okay.
Actually, I think Colonel Wilkerson and I do agree on some things here. He doesn't want to rush. I don't want to rush into it either.
Well, what do you think, Colonel? I mean, what do you think? Do you think that the current policy is actually working now?
No, I don't.
That we're close to winning this sort of the day when the Castros will fall?
I don't. I agree that the Castros are not long for this world. And what I was dealing with when I was down there were some of the 40-year-olds who are tentatively waiting in the wings to take over. And I was also dealing with a leadership, however reluctantly, that understands that it's got to figure out a way to turn over the reins to these 40-year-olds because there isn't any other future. One of the most dangerous things you can do, of course, if you've been running a dictatorship, especially one as harsh as Castro ran, is release a little. Ask Gaddafi. That's probably the most dangerous thing you can do. So one of the things that needs to be done is to sort of grease the path for these 40-year-olds so that when they are able to take over, they can prove their worth.
How do we grease the path?
Well, one of the ways we grease the path is the way the Canadians and the French and the Germans and others are doing. And Oxfam, by the way, who is a big contributor to Cuba, and that is to help those initiatives that promise, and one of the things that's doing that right now big time is remittances. Remittances have become number 3 or number 2, depending on whether you believe the CIA or the Cubans, on the Cuban GDP. So this is what President Obama has done. It is not insignificant. The remittances are flowing from Cuban Americans into Cuba, and they're doing things like, I went to a restaurant, La Moraleja, in Cuba the last day I was there, and that restaurant could have been in Buenos Aires, in Rio, in Bogota, in Caracas. It is a fabulous place with great service. They're making money there. How are they going to deal with this? Well, that's a big question. How are they going to deal with it? How are they going to tax it, and so forth and so on?
Is that a sign that there's increasing
It's
democracy?
a sign that people are getting a higher standard of living. And that's what I'm after. I'm after a higher standard of living for the 11.5 million Cubans who couldn't give a rat's ass less about who's governing them.
What do you say to that?
I think it's incredibly patronizing to the Cuban people. If you want to figure out how to pass power to these 40-year-olds, let the Cuban people decide. They're adults. They should have the right to self-determination and pick their own leaders. Don't pick it for them. Don't have a foreigner come in there and say, I want to grease the wheels to these 40-year-olds that I met at this exclusive restaurant that Cuban people cannot go to. I mean, is that really what we want?
There are a lot of Cubans there.
Well, I didn't interrupt you, Colonel Wilkerson.
Right.
You know, the Cuban economy is 80% controlled by generals. Now, maybe because you spent a lifetime in the military, you're fine with that. But we cannot have, this is not the proper way to do this. The Cuban that works for a hotel gets less than 10% of what that hotel pays for him or her. And, you know, and they can get tips. But the tips, if the government sees them getting tips, they can get into a lot of trouble.
Can I ask you this?
But let me just finish one thing, because this is something that the people who have swallowed this line keep talking about, the prostitution in 60 years ago. My goodness, what about the prostitution today? Did you see any of it? Because everyone who goes there sees it. It is rampant, and it is a corruption. This is something that the dissidents talk about, and it is something that is happening right now.
Let me ask you this, though, Mike. You know, discounting the prostitution, which I agree is real in Cuba, you also talked about people making tips and making money. And, you know, under the current previous system where there were no remittances going in, where there was no foreign investment going in, doctors and taxi cab drivers earn the same. Doesn't this investment, doesn't this free enterprise give people opportunities to create their own businesses, earn more money than they've ever earned before, and have a lifestyle they wouldn't have had before?
Change it, they don't. Taxi cab drivers make a lot more money than doctors.
Okay.
Every doctor wants to get one of those 1955 Buick so he can drive a cab for a foreigner from Europe. Again, do we want to pick for them? They're adults. Let them pick who they want to have as their next leader.
What's wrong with it? Taxi cab driver making more money.
Let me go on to another question, guys. I think both of you, we should take advantage of the fact that both of you probably have lots of interesting conversations with those in our government who are shaping policy. Take us inside a little bit of the current debate inside the Obama administration. Where does the Obama administration really stand on this, as far as you can tell? They've made changes in recent years, as you all probably know. They have lifted restrictions on remittances and travel for Cuban Americans. They have also allowed, for the first time, or not the first time since Clinton, purposeful travel by all Americans to Cuba. So, they call it the people-to-people travel program. How do the people who'd like more change feel about the Obama administration's moves, and what more should they be doing, if anything?
Well, I think if you're coming to me first,
yes,
I think the principal reaction I've sensed is that they're not that happy with it. I'd have to say that I'm partly in that category, but I understand the difficulties. The difficulties are this. Karl Rove told Colin Powell, don't touch Cuba because we want the 27 electoral votes in Florida. Dick Cheney even knew that our U.S.-Cuba policy was idiotic. Colin Powell knew our U.S.-Cuba policy was idiotic. But you don't touch Cuba policy because of 27 electoral votes in Florida. Anybody who doesn't know that simply is smoking something. Now, the Obama administration is the first to get into the White House, arguably, without the hardline Cuban vote in Florida. And so they have a little more flexibility with regard to that electoral college reality. However, as I said when I opened my remarks, this is an insignificant issue. So all you have to do in the Congress is go up to a senator or a congressman, if you're Ileana Ross-Slayton or you're anybody else, Menendez in the Senate, and you say, I'll give you my vote on these serious issues, Iran, the defense budget or whatever, if you'll give me your vote on Cuba. No, I'll throw in $10,000 to your PAC. Well, guess what happens? The vote's going to be for the hardliners in the Congress. So it's still a very difficult move for the Democrats to make. And the second reason it's a difficult move is the Democrats, as you all know, if you follow politics and you're here, so you must, the Democrats have difficulty showing any ankle on national security. So what does President Obama do if he suddenly says, well, I'm going to move towards normalized relations with Cuba, or even that I'm going to pick up this part of the embargo or whatever? It's a very difficult issue for the Democrats. It's an extremely difficult issue. So I don't bast him that hard.
Okay.
I like to also take my time.
Yes, please.
Colonel Wilkerson loves to talk about the money sloshing through Congress. My goodness. The money sloshing through Congress is the one being spent by the agribusinesses and the tourism industry, by the lobbyists that I don't know. I don't know who pays for Colonel Wilkerson, but he just said he was lobbying on behalf of agribusinesses. Well, they spend a lot of money. The little money that the Cuban Americans can put up against these corporations is nothing, is a pittance. Now, I really want to read to you from a letter that dissidents, these are dissidents inside of Cuba, some of them in prison, 500 signed this letter. This is what they said. They opposed the embargo, any initiative like lifting the embargo, because they're on record as opposing initiatives that, quote, with the best of intentions, tend to deviate focus and attention from what is happening on the island and would grant oxygen to the sinister totalitarian state that misgoverns our country. This is what they are saying. They're not free to say that in Cuba. The hard line that Colonel Wilkerson talks about is a free Cuban exercising constitutional freedoms in this country because the Cuban government does not allow them to speak their mind because they beat them up, because they put them in prison, because they keep families hostages, because they don't leave. It's one of the few countries in the world that does not allow you to leave. Why? Because it would be empty. No Cuban can own a boat, an island. Why? Because they know there will be a mass exodus. They don't want you to lift the embargo. There's a reason why. They don't want you to legitimize the people who beat them up. They don't want you to throw them a lifeline when they're a bunch of octogenarians about to die.
I've got to respond. I've got to respond to one thing.
Okay.
in this time and place where my colleagues in the Republican Party are taking money from everybody, whether it's the governor of Texas or Newt Gingrich, I've got to tell you, I don't take a cent from anybody. Have not, am not, and will not take a cent from anybody.
Okay, Colonel. Let me ask you this, Mike. You talked about the, what people on the island of Cuba want. Most opinion polls here in the United States say that the overwhelming majority of people in the United States favor lifting the embargo. Why should their opinions be subject to the will of a small group who oppose the change?
Well, I don't know. I'm confused. I thought a half hour ago nobody cared. Now people do suddenly care. I think it is immoral for us to deal with the generals. Now, I mean, I'm repeating myself here. It is a question of morality. Do we want to deal with the generals who are in charge of 80% of the Cuban economy, who are in charge of 100% of everything that has to do with the outside world? Is that really is that the best we want of ourselves?
I mean, sometimes the majority can be wrong.
But I haven't seen those numbers. I've looked at the numbers from IRI, and there's IRI people here in the International Republican Institute. They conducted a poll in Cuba. Unfortunately, Gallup cannot go to Cuba because opinion polls cannot be. So they have to be conducted, secretly.
I just meant here. I don't.
No, I know you meant there.
Okay.
I'm here to talk about the Cuban people.
Oh, okay.
If you want me to answer a question about why, I don't know. I haven't seen that poll, and I don't really have a response to it. I know what I know what I think is the right and moral thing to do, and I'm here speaking about it.
All right, Colonel. Let me ask you the flip side of that question. Does the Cuban American lobby play fair? I mean, I've heard you say that policy toward Cuba is being held hostage by special interest groups that represent less than 2% of the population. But isn't it a fact that's sort of one of the more progressive features of our brand of democracy, that sometimes the well-organized minority can prevail?
Well, that's absolutely true. De Tocqueville warned us about the tyranny of the majority, and I would warn us about the tyranny of the minority, though. It's just as bad as the tyranny of the majority. Witness our Israel policy vis-a-vis Iran right now. Israel may walk us into a war with Iran. That's not good for the United States of America, as far as I'm concerned. Last thing we need is another war. On the issue of the military, I was in Cuba in 2007, 2009, and then recently last week. And I have to tell you that two different Coast Guard defense attaches, we don't call them that, but that's really what they are in the intersection, have told me that their relationship with the Cuban military is the best in the Caribbean, even better than Mexico. And that's on counterterrorism, that's on counter-narcotics, that's on counter-people trafficking. It's on almost every illicit activity you can imagine that happens in the Caribbean, and with the Russians increasingly moving into the Caribbean, it's becoming more than just narcotics and terrorism. So it's a very professional military. I don't doubt at all that the military is involved in the economy, just like China's is. China's is hugely involved in the economy. As a matter of fact, about every other military in the world, other than the OECD nations, is involved in the economy, because they have to be. The state can't afford them if they're not. Burma. This is not an issue. It is an issue, though, and Mike's right about that. The real power is the military, just like it's going to be anywhere if you've got guns and bullets. So you've got to have a good relationship with the military, and you've got to make sure that that military understands that its interests are best protected, and therefore it should protect these 40-year-old technocrats who are going to take over, and not be looking back to Raul and to Fidel and to all the old guys. And that's a very important thing, and it's something our military is doing right now very effectively. And frankly, this is one reason why I say I don't want to move too fast, because the military would not like to publicize that much, because they feel like doing it on the sly, as it were, is easier and better, and ultimately will produce a more positive result than suddenly saying, hey, here we are, working with the Cubans in the Caribbean. Look at this.
I think the military, the American military you talk to, should talk to the State Department, because the last time I checked, it lists Cuba as one of the state sponsors of terrorism. Again, I'm not comfortable, and I don't think we should be here in this audience or in this country, with dealing with generals or trying to come in and grease a path the undemocratic path for 40-year-olds who have not been elected by anybody, are not representative of anyone, in grease a path for them to grant power. Cubans are adults. They have a right to express themselves. They have a right to express themselves at the polling booth, and they have a right to do these things. It is incredibly patronizing to say, we're going to deal with the military, we're going to strike deals with them, strike joint ventures with them, and grease the path for 40-year-old technocrats. China, first of all, the group itself that Colonel Wilkerson grouped the Cubans with, you know, Burma, China, what a model. China had a Deng Xiaoping. I reported from China for 10 years. You know, Cuba hasn't had a Deng Xiaoping. Cuba still has the Castro brother. It's almost comical if it weren't terrifying and sad. So to compare China and what they have done, the way they went from the death of Mao to the Gang of Five, to Deng Xiaoping, to Jiang Zemin, to the Castro family, which is now preparing to pass the reins to the niece, Mariela Castro. I mean, what is this? This is, to compare China with Cuba is not to really understand Cuba nor China. It hasn't had a Deng Xiaoping. It still has the Castros.
Let me just say that my seminal diplomacy in the summer of 2001 and 2002 for Richard Haas was with China. That's my area of expertise. Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea. Studied it for 30 years, served there for 20. When I talk to people like Wang Yi and Shui Tenkai and people who are really influential inside the Chinese Politburo process, when I talk to the Central Party School and the people there who make Chinese strategy, I don't come away feeling like that Cuba is a threat. I come away feeling that the biggest threat to the United States of America in the future is the Republic of China. Now, that's not because it has to be that way. It's because power is power. And the Chinese are assembling an awesome economic, military, cultural, and even societal power in this world. Go back to 1828. In 1828, the Chinese had the biggest GDP in the world. So this is just coming around again. I am not worried about Cuba threatening the United States of America. Thank you very much. I am worried about China.
I think you just made my point, though. You said that we should behave toward Cuba the same way we have behaved toward China. We say China's our biggest threat right now. Yeah, China probably is a big threat because it's not a democratic country. None of the economic openings which they had, which have improved a lot of the Chinese people, have produced democracy. China has the distinction of being the only country in the world that has more journalists in prison than Cuba. China is 1.3 billion people. Cuba is 11 million people. China is not a model to look to. And if you say, I think we're ending up in the same place, Colonel Wilkerson, you say China's going to be our biggest threat. Yes, I agree with you. And it's because it's not a democracy.
Well, great. Now that we're all at the same place, let me open this up to questions.
I was in Haiti from 2000 through 2006, working very closely with President Aristide and his group. Mr. Gonzalez mentioned the International Republican Institute. They were also there trying to destroy Haiti the whole time I was there. And one of the things that amazes me is the story about the women getting stripped on the way to church. By golly, we heard all that before, plus the fact that Aristide sucked the blood of children, okay? None of which were true. My question is, though, something you said. You said the island is getting blacker, and that concerns me. What do you mean by that?
No. What I meant is the island, there's more and more Afro-Cubans, and the Cuban government is almost exclusively white. There's one person in the Council of State that represents the leader of the opposition in Tunis is black. He is Cuba's Nelson Mandela. That's what I said. Now, with regards to Haiti, I don't know anything about that. So I can't really debate that with you. But there's a wonderful thing called Google. Google these women. Google Las Damas de Blancos. Don't believe me. Go home, not today because I think they've experienced some difficulties. Go tomorrow. Google or YouTube Las Damas de Blanco. So don't believe me, go to your computer.
Okay, thank you.
Let me address your question from another perspective. When the earthquake occurred, this is just demonstrate my frustration with the embargo and with the dumb relations we have and everything. When the earthquake occurred, I had to email a friend of mine in President Lula's office in Brasilia in order to get the Commandant of the Marine Corps to kick off a helicopter a load of medical supplies that the Cubans, who were already in Haiti and perfectly competent to take care of some of the problems but didn't have the equipment to do so, could in fact perform and help Haitians. That's how stupid this relationship is. And let me tell you something else. If that oil well that they're going to drill in the, about 56, 60 miles off the coast of Florida should do a BP, we're going to be in deep kimchi. Because we are not, we have at least, this administration's been smart enough at least to send some professionals down there to talk with the Cubans. And I had a conversation with them and with the Cubans to whom they talked while I was down there. So at least we recognize the fact that this is really serious stuff and we better be ready to do it. But it'd be a whole lot better if we had some kind of better relationship so that we could say, yes, we're going to help you if you have an oil spill. Because we know it's going to come up the Florida Strait to the greatest biodiversity left in this country, on the coast of Florida. So we need to protect the environment, and we need to have a better relationship in order to do that.
Colonel Wilkerson, the reason why, I mean, Cuba is an impoverished, penurious island, and the reason why it is not because of our embargo. It's because communism doesn't work. Communism didn't work in Korea. Communism didn't work in Asia. Communism didn't work in Germany. What makes you think it's going to produce wealth in the Caribbean? The Cuban economy is in ruins today. It is a shadow of its old self because socialist policies have failed. Now, let me say something about Haiti, which is one or two, is always there with Bolivia as one of the most impoverished countries in the hemisphere. Haiti has 3 times the internet penetration that Cuba has. The reason for that is because the gerontocracy that's running Cuba does not want the Cubans to be able to speak to the outside nor speak to each other freely. Think about that. Cuba has 1/3 the internet penetration that Haiti has.
Mr. Gonzalez, it seems to me like all of the passion and all of the positions you have taken are the strongest argument for engagement with the Cuban people on every level possible to break down the barriers that the people on the island feel between themselves and the rest of the world. If you engage with a people, if you show the people and their rulers that each citizen of the world is responsible for each other citizen, if you show that you care, if you make an effort to break down the barriers that I think a small number of people are interested in keeping up, where is the downside in that? And also, before going to that, under the portrait that you're giving us, I don't see any way forward whatsoever. I mean, what is your solution?
You ask a very good question, and I kind of agree with you. I think that if we were able to go and have relations with the Cubans themselves, if we were able to hire them, we were able to pay them, and they would keep the money, I would be more comfortable with that than forming joint ventures with the generals and having them keep more than 90% of what we pay the Cubans. If we were able to, there's a man in prison today, a Marylander named Alan Gross. His sin, his crime, was to take computers to hand them out to Cuba's Jewish community. This was a crime in Cuba. This man is being held hostage right now. He was doing what you want people to do. That is impossible to do in Cuba right now. Alan Gross is a living testament to that. Your second question, given what I'm presenting, where's the way forward? You know, I don't know what the way forward is. The way forward is perhaps sitting down and waiting for them to die, and I hope they hurry up. But we could use international pressure to tell the Cubans, this is unacceptable. We're not going to ignore what you're doing behind your borders. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you started off agreeing with me or not, but I really want to convince you, it is unacceptable. Don't ignore the plight of Cubans. Don't just turn your back because you have some romantic notion of Che Guevara or Fidel Castro.
There are two sides to every story, I believe, as a journalist. Give us the other side of the Alan Gross story as well.
Well, I learned as a
Since
diplomat.
he came up.
Is there another side to that?
I learned as a
There's
diplomat, there's
always
5
another
sides.
side to a story.
Maybe
Exactly.
6, maybe 7.
Exactly.
Did you just say Alan Gross was a spy?
Alan Gross is a special situation, just as the Cuban 5 are a special situation. I could sit up here if I had an hour and tell you that the Cuban 5 in their trial remind me of Judge Roy Bean or something like that. It certainly doesn't remind me of justice. On change of venue alone, the entire process that convicted the Cuban 5 and put them in jail, one of them for 2 life sentences plus 15 years, all have served 13. One is out on parole right now, but can't go back to Cuba and see his wife. He's in Florida, has to stay in Florida for 3 years of his parole. A trumped up case, utterly trumped up. But both Alan Gross and the Cuban 5 were guilty of breaking the opposing country's laws, which essentially boil down to a foreign agent operating on our soil, foreign agent operating on Cuban soil. The facts about Alan Gross have been obfuscated and made a mess. Alan Gross, I don't know if he knew what he was doing, but he definitely was breaking Cuban law. Now, a 15-year sentence is a little draconian, but look, the Cubans are reciprocating. 2 life sentences plus 15 years and a totally cocked up trial in Dade County, Florida. I mean, it was so cocked up that the United States government, and I've got the papers on this, the United States government was actually sending money down to people to publish stories in Miami newspapers and to go on TV in order to prejudice the jury pool. So this is not justice. It is the only trial that I'm aware of ever occurring in the United States that drew such international condemnation. Nobel laureates, presidents, prime ministers, others declaimed on it and said, what a nasty deal you did, almost as much as they did on Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and some of the other torture-related activities and rendition programs. So Alan Gross and the Cuban 5 could be settled in a heartbeat. All we'd have to do is say, come home, Alan, go home, Cuban 5. Everything would be settled, no harm done, and here's my real point.
I am happy.
No impact on national security whatsoever. But a whole lot of good feelings on both sides of the strait.
I'm happy to debate our judicial system versus the Cuban judicial system all night. I don't know what the Cuban 5 have to do with this. The Cuban, Colonel Wilkerson loves to deviate on the Cuban 5. The Cuban 5, the FBI had the goods on them. The jury that convicted them didn't have a single Cuban American. Colonel Wilkerson never tells you that. The judge was not a Cuban American. The prosecutors were not Cuban American. The FBI simply, I trust the FBI. It had the goods on these people. Alan Gross was there doing what that gentleman, Mr. Davis, proposed doing. He was there trying to deal with the Cuban people, handing them computers. To compare Alan Gross with these spies, I mean, let's just go back and talk about dealing with the people of Cuba. And anyway, you're on record having said what you said about Alan Gross.
Just one riposte. The Jewish community in Cuba disavows any needs from, association with, or wish to be associated with Alan Gross. And yet his story is he was down there trying to provide the Jewish community in Cuba with a means to communicate. They have a means to communicate and are very happy with it.
Yeah, they're probably afraid to voice their opinion. Cuba's internet penetration is 1/3 that of Haiti's.
All right. So this is just one story of one man and 15 opinions about what he was doing.
Actually, I hadn't heard that
You see
opinion
how
before, that he was a spy.
You see how complicated this is, everyone?
But it could be solved.
All right, your question, please.
How often are we talking to the Cuban government?
That's a good question.
Excellent question.
And this is just for the audience, just by show of hands. If the trade and travel embargo was lifted, how many people would go if they had the means?
How much are we talking to the Cuban government? And
Well,
what are our
here's-
channels of communication?
Here's what I got from, and I got to be careful about this because he asked me to be, let's say I got this from a high-level government official in Cuba,
I'm
U.S.
used to those kinds of comments. Yeah,
A
right.
U.S. official.
Right.
said the same thing. Where's the gentleman who was just up? He said the same thing you just said. And then we pressed him. And he admitted that the Cubans have put several proposals on the table in response to what they consider to be President Obama's relaxation of certain aspects of the relationship. So far, the United States has not responded. And here's what he said was the reason why. 2 words, Alan Gross. And that the administration has made that a, we will not go beyond this. Until you release Alan Gross, we will go no further. I then said, because I've been in this business for a long time, I said, how about if you did something like this? You know, I hate to be an incrementalist. All State Department people are incrementalists. I like to be military, you know, can do, let's take the hill. But I said, let me play diplomat for a minute. How about if we let Ambassador Bolaños, the Cuban ambassador here in the United States, travel in the United States? And we let you travel in Cuba? Because I know they'd reciprocate. Whoever starts this dance, the other one will reciprocate, I know. And if they don't, you can shut it down. Right now, our diplomats can't go 25 miles in Cuba. If he wants to go out to Santiago de Cuba, if he wants to go out to Guantanamo, he can't go. And Ambassador Bolaños can't go anywhere either. He can't even take his kid to Disney World. Let's start simply. Let's start. Let's say to Cuba, okay, you let our guy travel, we'll let your guys travel. And let the intersection here in Washington travel anywhere it wants to. My God, that great FBI can watch them. And let our people travel in Cuba. This is a good start, and it's that kind of engagement that the other gentleman was talking about. How can our diplomats do their job if they can't get out in the countryside? And then something else, and something else, and something else. This is constructive engagement.
We know from the reality of sanctions that repeatedly the people who are harmed by them are not elites. The people harmed by them, people who are harmed by them in Iraq, the people who are harmed by them and are targeted, according to a senior US intelligence official in Iran now, is the innocent people of a country. And as much as you can say you love Cuba, that's fantastic, yes, help the people, but you're making their life more difficult. That's what the point of this embargo was to do. I just don't see how you can justify the people that are being punished in Cuba.
No, I think you have it wrong. Cuba is open and trades with Europe, trades with Latin America. The fact that they don't have things to
I know
eat,
they trade with Europe. I'm from England.
The fact that they don't have things to eat is because of communism. Because of communism. Hang on, I'll let you ask a question. Okay. I mean, they have communism mismanagement. Communism failed in Germany. North Koreans are a foot shorter than South Koreans. It failed in Cuba. It had nothing to do with the embargo. And the people dealing with them right now, as I said, and this is something that Colonel Wilkerson cannot rebut, over 90% of the wages we pay the Cuban people go to the generals. So dealing with them right now, I don't see how, and by the way, listen to them. Listen to what they write. Listen to what they say. They don't say what you're saying.
All right. I'd like to keep
I'm
us
with you.
moving unless, yeah.
Thank you.
Unless you
I hate sanctions.
Well, I mean, all political theorists who assess the impact of sanctions, assess their impact on the people, assess how they don't genuinely work to change elites, how they actually disadvantage the people. So if you want to disagree with hundreds of academic scholars, that's fine.
Say that to Nelson Mandela.
One of the reasons we finally saw the light in Burma was what you just said. We were actually hurting the Burmese people badly with the sanctions, and we were rewarding the generals.
No, I cannot let that go on. It goes sad. Aung San Suu Kyi, the elected leader of Burma, who has been in house arrest by the generals, who, like the Cuban generals, repressed them. She gave the go-ahead because she thought that the new leader was of a different type. That's when we opened up. When Aung San Suu Kyi, the elected leader, said to us, gave us the green light. Okay, so let me just set the record straight on that one.
There are always multiple reasons for these things. He's right that was part of it, but part of it also was we saw what the sanctions were doing.
All right,
sanctions were hurting people.
We need to wrap up, but we could. Do you have a question, sir? Let's take one last question, and then we'll have closing statements by our panelists.
How can you engage the people of Cuba without some arrangement with the regime? That you've got to hold your nose and pay a price up to a point. That's what we did in Eastern Europe. That's what we did in the Soviet Union. And that, that works. The aim is not to support the regime. The aim is, if you will, to change it. But you've got to come at this, from both sides. And I wonder, I wonder if you could address whether you think that could work in Cuba.
Thank you for your
I think if we normalize relations right now, we would legitimize the people. They would say it's like the wife beater who wants to say, "Look, I beat you up, and you show up at the pool with a black eye, but it's fine. Everyone says it's fine. I still come to the club. This is just the way it is. Nobody thinks it's abnormal." It's legitimizing the regime that way. I don't think it would right now. What the situation is right now, I don't think any trade would help the people of Cuba, and I think we should listen to the people of Cuba themselves. Not worry about the Cuban Five or the embargo or Miami. Let's talk about the people of Cuba right now. Concentrate on what's happening there. At least extract some demands.
If the embargo were lifted right away, I think we both sides of the strait would have real problems. So I wouldn't think that should be done right away. As I said, I'd much rather see an incremental policy. Sometimes I labor under the conspiracy theory that Ileana and the hardliners here are in league with Fidel. It looks like it. It actually looks like it. Because I don't think Fidel wants the embargo lifted. I don't think Ileana does either. So, they are actually aiding and abetting each other. Every time we get to some point where where it looks like with Nixon or with Carter or with Clinton, or any other president who's tried to relax a little bit, and JFK wanted to after the Cuban Missile Crisis, every time we get there, somebody throws something out that stops us from doing it, the latest, of course, being the Brothers to the Rescue shoot-down incident. So neither one wants it lifted, so we're not going to get it lifted. But better relations would do lots of things, and I agree with you that you have to hold your nose, and you have to have a certain relationship with the existing leadership in order to have any possibility of influencing change in the future. And I'm not saying we influence change, as he seems to imply, through force like we've done for the last 100 years vis-a-vis Cuba. I'm saying we let the Cuban people get to the point where they can determine what kind of government they want, and then we butt out. Trade-wise, economics, cultural and art exchanges, education, that's fine, but we butt out of legislating, mind you. We've legislated, as we did with Iraq and we're trying to do with Iran, regime change. We legislate that we're going to change another country's government, and the other country doesn't like us.
I'll give the closing remarks of the people the 500 dissidents who signed this letter. The below signatories believe that the freedom of Cuba will not arrive by means of the pocketbook, nor the lips of libidinous tourists who are septic to the pain of the Cuban family. For that reason, we suggest that you maintain, this is a letter to Congress, that you maintain a firm and coherent policy of pressure and condemnation towards the tyranny of Havana. That will represent solidarity with the victims of repression. That is where I am. That's where I'd like to close. And that is what I ask you to at least mull tonight as you think about this debate.
I hope you can see that this is a very sort of volatile, very personal in some ways debate. And I think our speakers represented their viewpoints very well. So let's thank them for being here.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.